The community of Hollow Water came together to address the legacies of colonization in a new, old way. Hollow Water is a small Ojibwe Anishinaabe First Nations community in what is now called Canada. Like many such Indigenous communities in Canada and around the world, the experience of colonization for this community has been one of incredible violence, oppression, and injustice across centuries. Hollow Water is a community of just a few hundred people, far from urban and commercial centers. Among the impacts of the horror story that is the colonial experience in this community was a decades-long epidemic of sexual abuse. Approximately 2/3 of Hollow Water's residents had been victims of domestic and sexual abuse, often committed by members of their own families. Colonial violence, both physical and structural, and the erasure of culture and traditional ways through practices such as residential schools and Christian missions, bequeathed to Hollow Water legacies of poverty, mistrust, severed relationships, addiction, and shame that manifested in these horrific ways. The ongoing isolation of and discrimination against Indigenous people and communities in Canada contributes to the persistence of these impacts even till today. And though this epidemic of sexual abuse had been happening in Hollow Water for years, it was not something that was acknowledged by the community. Indeed, even its elders were caught up in this web of violence and silence. It was an unspoken secret, even as it devastated the lives of the majority of Hollow Water's people. Mainstream attempts to address this epidemic made no difference. Incarcerating those who had committed acts of abuse did not stop more abuse from happening. Social workers were unable to interrupt or halt these behaviors within families, and the material supports that they provided proved insufficient to facilitate sustainable change. And Western medical and therapeutic responses like drug and alcohol rehab did not provide the healing that the community needed. It seemed almost impossible from the outside to make meaningful change in the face of such an overwhelming problem. Several leaders in Hollow Water, however, advocated for a different way forward for the community to address this epidemic. Western colonial systems had failed. And so, reclaiming their traditional knowledge and practices, they emphasized the need for healing alongside accountability. Rather than mere punishment, the community designed a process of repair and transformation. What was needed in the community was spiritual, emotional, physical, and relational healing. Sending people to prison was not going to provide such healing, and neither was anything else that had already been tried and failed. And so, the people of Hollow Water implemented a multi-pronged approach rooted in their traditional values and practices. A series of healing circles, a practice used by many Indigenous communities in North America and grounded in the sacred teaching of the medicine wheel, were reintroduced to the community. Kathy Lewis, a member of Samson Cree Nation and a Canadian Parole Board member, called these circles a form of, quote, traditional healing based in spirituality, end quote. In these circles, which the people of Hollow Water called the Community Holistic Circle Healing Program, people who had caused harm, the person or persons that they'd harmed, and members of the wider community, including elders, gathered together in a series of talking circles to share stories about what had happened. They also discussed how they could repair the harms and heal the wounds that resulted from any particular incident of abuse, and to heal the wounds, both individual and communal, that led to that particular incident occurring. Prior to a large community-wide circle in which victims, offenders, and the broader Hollow Water community came together, There were other healing circles made up entirely of those who committed sexual abuse. And similarly, those who had experienced sexual abuse were in circles with one another to share their stories and came to know that they were not alone in their experience. In addition to the victim, offender, and community circles, there were also Ojibwe circles. And these circles examined and told the story of the experience of colonization for the people of Hollowater and provided a historical context for the community troubles that they faced. And then, finally, there would be a community-wide circle in which the entire community would be invited, and sometimes up to 250 members would attend to come to a shared decision about the best way to keep children who'd been sexually abused in the community as safe as possible, and to provide avenues for accountability and eventual reintegration into the community for offenders. And remember, there were many who were both victims and offenders at the same time in this example. Traditional practices like smudging, songs, and more are a part of the ritual of these circles. Talking pieces are used in which a meaningful item, often a hawk or eagle feather, but it could be anything, are passed around the circle. Only the person holding the talking piece is invited to speak so that each person has an equal opportunity to share their own stories and perspectives. In addition, there are circle keepers who facilitate and tend to the circle and lead them in a non-hierarchical way. A woman named Burma Bushy was one of the first of these keepers, and she would become one of the earliest and greatest advocates for the power of peacemaking circles. Soon after the introduction of the Community Holistic Circle Healing Program, it quickly became clear that the majority of those who had committed sexual abuse were also the victims of sexual abuse. Clear lines between victim and offender were not possible in this community. And as people shared their stories, this horrible secret became known. And people who had felt unseen for decades began to be seen in their full humanity. As some have described it, an outbreak of healing had begun in Hollowater. And so the community trained more people to keep these circles, and more of them began occurring. In addition, other traditional practices, such as traditional dance ceremonies, sweat lodges, drum dances, and wilderness journeys in which young people spent time reconnecting with their traditional lands and listening to the wisdom of elders, were reintroduced to the community as a way to relearn their old ways. And the pairing of healing circles with these cultural reclamation projects has been referred to as returning to the spirit trainings, or simply as returning to the teachings. However it's named, there was a revival of traditional ways of knowing and being that had been suppressed by colonization and the generational traumas it caused. The community found that this approach better achieved what the community needed, which was a justice that heals. And it also stemmed the tide of sexual abuse in the community. This new old way of addressing harms in the community worked, and it did so by deepening relational bonds, reinvigorating traditional ways of knowing and being, and rejecting a vision of accountability as punishment by embracing a vision of accountability as repair and healing. And in another part of modern-day Canada, in the Yukon Territory, another experiment with circles took place. Harold Gattensby, a Tlingit man who survived residential schools and was incarcerated at the time, had heard about circles being used among Indigenous peoples elsewhere, and suggested to Judge Barry Stewart that they should be tried in Yukon. Judge Stewart later also heard Burma Bushy present on Hollowater at a conference, and became even more interested in utilizing circles in that other part of Canada with Tlingit communities. And so he began working with Harold to create a circle in which elders and community members sat with young men who had been convicted of crimes. These circles proved to be successful as recidivism rates among those who participated were lower than those who only experienced incarceration, and self-reports of experiences of deep healing were often shared. Harold Gettensby and his brother Phil, along with Judge Stewart and another judge, Mark Wedge of Tagish descent, came to become some of the most important advocates in the world of peacemaking circles, as a means to relearn traditional ways of healing and peacemaking. In addition to becoming circle keepers among their own communities, they began taking the message of what they were learning and taught many others across North America about the power of peacemaking circles as a means of healing, community building, and reforming criminal justice systems that were disproportionately incarcerating Indigenous and other poor people of color across Turtle Island, what we now call North America. One of the early places that they taught peacemaking and healing circles was to an organization near Boston, Massachusetts, called ROCA, which seeks to intervene in and prevent youth violence in poor urban communities, primarily communities of color. For example, ROCA was intervening in violence in Southeast Asian communities and working with many young teenagers who were themselves refugees or were the children of refugees. Peacemaking and healing circles became a vital practice in their successful work to transform the lives of these young people. And the story of this experience is recounted in Carolyn Boyes Watson's now classic book, Peacemaking Circles and Urban Youth. One of the young men profiled in that book, Sarome Fung, and one of his students named Shasta Kano Martin of Lummi Nation became some of my earliest teachers in peacemaking circles. And Sarome learned how to be a circle keeper from Harold, Mark Wedge, and the rest. And my story is not unique. Peacemaking and healing circles became a practice that's now utilized in system-connected and community-based restorative justice and transformative justice initiatives around the world. The particularities of each context and practice are unique, but the principles are often consistent. Justice as healing, for self and for the community. In most cases, despite the particularities of context, the contemporary practice of these circles, wherever they might be found, can be traced back to Tagish, Tlingit, and Ojibwe communities in the Yukon Territory and in Hollow Water. From Burma Bushy to Harold and Phil Gettensby and several others have come generations of circle keepers and peacemakers across Turtle Island and beyond. In the southwestern United States, in Navajo country, another indigenous peacemaking revolution was happening in their tribal courts. Chief Justice Robert Yazzie noticed the same ineffectiveness noticed by the people of Hollow Water, Tlingit Territory, and other indigenous communities. Mainstream criminal legal systems were ineffective at preventing harm, doing justice, or providing healing to those who've caused or experienced harm, especially when they're related to the ongoing harms of colonization. And so Judge Yazzie introduced alternative forms of justice in Navajo courts, grounded in their traditional teachings about interconnectedness, being a good relation, and reintegration into community after harm has occurred. Navajo peacemaking also uses a circle process, though it's distinct in some ways from those practiced by Hollow Water or in Tagish Tlingit country. And they are, as Yazzie has said, a form of, quote, horizontal justice, as opposed to the vertical justice that's often imposed by Western legal systems. He has said, quote, the horizontal justice model uses a horizontal line to portray equality. No person is above another. A better description of the horizontal model, and one often used by Indians to portray their thought, is a circle. In a circle, there's no right or left, nor is there a beginning or an end. Every point or person on the line of a circle looks to the same center as the focus. The circle is the symbol of Navajo justice because it is perfect, unbroken, and a simile of unity and oneness. It conveys the image of people gathering together for discussion. End quote. Other ways Yazzie's described Navajo peacemaking justice is as healing, like the people of Hollow Water did, and as solidarity. He has said, quote, "The term solidarity is essential to an understanding of both Navajo healing and justice. The Navajo understanding of solidarity is difficult to translate into English, but it carries connotations which help the individual to reconcile self with family, community, nature, and the cosmos. The sense of oneness with one's surroundings and the reconciliation of the individual with everyone and everything makes an alternative to vertical justice work. Navajo justice rejects simply convicting a person and putting them in prison. Instead, it favors methods which use solidarity to restore good relations among people. Most importantly, it restores good relations with self." End quote. And it's not just Native, First Nation, and Indigenous communities in connection to formal legal systems who've picked up peacemaking and healing circles. Recognizing that many Chicanos and Latinx people have indigenous ancestry, there have been several Mexican American and other Latin American activists and leaders who've used versions of healing circles in community-based settings. Jerry Tello, a co-founder of the National Compadres Network, has argued, quote, "La cultura cura," end quote. The culture is the cure. And he and others have utilized healing circles with young Latino men who've caused or experienced harm to find new ways of practicing masculinity as the work of being a healer and a peacemaker. And so people with Native and Indigenous ancestry across North America have utilized peacemaking and healing circles to address historic legacies and contemporary instances of great harm, violence, and oppression. Sometimes these circles are formally connected to legal systems as a form of alternative sentencing or diversion, and other times they occur in communities seeking their healing beyond the systems imposed by colonial governments. In their emphasis on bringing people together, storytelling, repair, and integration, they are consistent with the idea of restorative justice. And many non-Indigenous peoples, some who've been taught by Indigenous practitioners and others who haven't, are using them in formal restorative justice programs. But I think it needs to be said that the people of Hollow Water refer to this work as traditional healing, and Chief Justice Yazzie has referred to it as Navajo peacemaking, and even as some other Indigenous practitioners use the language of restorative justice to describe their healing work. But no matter what it's called, in every instance, these practices both address contemporary harms, violent and otherwise, and also the historical harms and traumas that are the context in which such contemporary crime and wrongdoing occurs. Healing circles are both an alternative way to do justice in our contemporary world and a rebirth and contextual application of ancient wisdoms that colonial systems sought to extinguish. That these practices are still here and are thriving in teaching Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples better ways to live together is a testament to their power. And there are still many questions to be asked of circles, restorative justice, healing, and the like that aren't answered by this historical overview. But one can't engage those questions without first knowing the context out of which this practice emerged and has spread. Indigenous peoples across this continent have identified our mainstream systems as broken, unjust, and ineffective, and are building alternative ways of doing justice as healing. And nearly everywhere you look, circles are at the center of that work.